can you spend your way toward low inflation? That's a question you might well be asking in the light of the latest federal budget, because Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese seem to think that you can. The federal budget was laden with fiscal stimulus, laden with handouts, and laden with government intervention into the economy. Jim Chalmers painted this as an anti-inflationary budget, a budget that would get CPI inflation below 3%. However, not all economists are convinced, and in fact many economists have poked holes in Jim Chalmers' budget, poked holes in his reasoning, and have highlighted that the federal budget might in fact be inflationary and might make things rather worse. So let's go through one of the key aspects of this, being the energy subsidies, or the handouts to try to get energy prices slightly down, because Jim Chalmers has painted these as the primary reason the budget is anti-inflationary. But in reality, he is somewhat pulling the wool over our eyes. So to start with, let's look at some of the economists' reactions to Jim Chalmers' and Anthony Albanese's budget. Chris Richardson, an independent economist, stated, "My big ask of the budget was that it didn't poke the inflationary bear. I didn't think that it passed that test. The government said that it would be careful not to front load with new costs. But that's exactly what it did. Its new dollars are both big and fast." Stephen Helmerich of CBA stated, "The risk is now more real that the first interest rate cut could be delayed, and that the neutral cash rate is higher than we currently estimated due to the expansionary fiscal setting and the high level of investment in the economy. Or phrased differently, the government spending is making inflation rather worse." Andrew Lilly of Barrenjoey stated, "These subsidies just make inflation stickier, both directly in measurement, i.e. lifting inflation in 2025, and indirectly by relaxing budget constraints." Paul Bloxham of HSBC stated, "We expect the boost to household disposable incomes from these subsidies and the substantial boost to disposable income from the personal income tax cuts will see increased consumer spending, which will support underlying inflation rather than lower it." Richard Holden of UNSW stated, "Chalmers argues that the energy subsidies reduce actual inflation. That's just wrong. Bunkum. Fake numbers." Stephen Hamilton of the ANU and George Washington University stated, "The most irresponsible budget in recent memory. During an inflation crisis with the RBA on the precipice of further rate increases, it's downright reckless." So in short, many economists think this budget is terrible at this point in time. They think the budget is going to make inflation worse, and the fiscal stimulus makes matters worse, not better, and makes the RBA's job harder, not easier. So let's look a little bit into this, because indeed it is rather difficult to find an economist or a financial economist who thinks the budget actually improves things or reduces inflation. Now, the budget has several inflationary aspects to my mind, but I'm going to focus on the one that Jim Chalmers specifically is focused on, the energy handouts, which he claims are deflationary, or at least disinflationary. These are essentially a $300 energy rebate that lasts for 1 year. It only goes for 1 year, then it expires. Now, he is actually dead wrong that these are deflationary in the economically relevant sense. So what exactly is the problem with these subsidies and these handouts? And why do they worsen inflation? Well, to see this, we need to think about several ways that inflation could be categorized. First, we've got simplistic headline inflation. So for example, this is CPI inflation that you might see read out on the news. Now, this number isn't actually as meaningful as some people make it out to be, because the headline CPI inflation figure can contain a lot of volatile items. So for example, fuel will fluctuate quite significantly month on month. So that headline inflation number can be a little bit all over the place, but it can be worthwhile just at a glance. Then we've got core inflation. This is variously called trimmed mean inflation, whatever the case might be, but I'm going to call it core inflation at the moment, which is what it's called in the United States. Core inflation is the price growth excluding volatile items. So for example, it's the growth in the prices of things like shelter or services. It excludes price changes in things that are seen as volatile, such as energy. Now, this is because those things can fluctuate significantly. Core inflation is closer to what the RBA would be focusing on. Next, we've got short-dated inflation. This is inflation month on month or quarter on quarter. That is the price change over short intervals. This can be extremely volatile. It can vary with random shocks. So for example, if a conflict breaks out, that can cause changes in this short-term inflation rate. However, it is also still very important because it gives us an idea about the rate of change in inflation. It gives us an idea about the trajectory of inflation. And if we look for a trend in those short-dated inflation numbers, we can see where inflation is heading. Obviously, we need to disentangle some of the bumps along the road, but it gives us some insight. So say, for example, there is a short, sharp reduction in a particular price, and that causes prices to go down right now. Well, that might reduce year-on-year inflation, but the Reserve Bank is still going to be focused on what is going to happen month-on-month and quarter-on-quarter thereafter. They're going to focus on the underlying growth rate that is going to exist into the future, not just what happened in the past. Then finally, we've got what I'll call adjusted inflation. That is inflation adjusted for extraordinary items. This is not generally reported per se, but it underlies the inflation figures, and it's what the RBA is really going to look for. It's the inflation when you wind back and set off the one-off sugar hits. It's the actual inflation rate, the actual growth rate, when you remove the short-term things the government might have done. So when you, for example, ignore a short-term handout and disentangle the underlying growth rate due to supply and demand from one-off sugar hits. That adjusted inflation is particularly what the RBA might focus on. Now, the handouts that Jim Chalmers is bringing out, they might reduce the simplistic headline inflation, although that isn't clear-cut. They could reduce it by, for example, driving down energy prices in a one-off short-term manner, in which case you get a short, sharp staccato reduction in energy prices. However, that does nothing to adjust the underlying growth rate in energy, because after that short, sharp reduction, energy prices would simply keep growing, and they would grow back to where they were, and the RBA is going to be focused on that growth rate. Furthermore, energy itself is a volatile commodity, and is not part of core inflation. And therefore, the RBA might be a little bit less attuned to that. They're going to be focusing on how this factors into things like services. Furthermore, the money that people are getting from this handout could and would be easily spent elsewhere. So for example, if it's someone who didn't necessarily need the handout, so to speak, they might spend the money on discretionary items. If it's someone who really needed the money, well, they're clearly going to spend that on those other things they needed to spend the money on. For example, deferred maintenance on a car or a house. Therefore, it isn't clear that the actual reduction in the simplistic inflation is really going to exist. Furthermore, the handout doesn't address the structural supply and demand issues that might influence price growth. It does not, for example, encourage energy conservation. It doesn't encourage people to use less power, for example. It doesn't do anything to create more power. What it does is it creates a short reduction in power bills. But that could potentially make people marginally more lax with the use of power if energy is now seen as slightly cheaper. Furthermore, as indicated, this could also increase demand elsewhere. The handout also, as I've indicated, is a one-off payment effectively. It only goes for 1 year. However, the RBA is going to consider sustainable or latent inflation, not just inflation due to one-off handouts. They're not going to rely on the government doing one-off handouts ad infinitum. Rather, they're going to look at the underlying supply and demand dynamics. A one-off handout would do nothing to improve the growth rate in prices and to lower that growth rate. Prices would simply grow from that new base that has been artificially lowered by the government. Furthermore, when that handout expires, there's nothing to say that prices wouldn't just ratchet up to where they were beforehand, creating an inflationary spike. The RBA is not naive. They're not myopic. They can see through one-off sugar hits. The RBA is going to look at continued growth month-on-month and quarter-on-quarter and then year-on-year. Therefore, even if there is a one-off reduction in prices, the RBA is going to look at the trajectory in price growth, not just the one-off stimulus. And as a result, this one-off stimulus payment, does nothing to affect the inflation in the relevant sense. It does nothing to lower the inflation the RBA is going to consider. Furthermore, it does nothing to affect the price growth, i.e. nothing beneficial anyway. It does nothing to get the growth in energy prices under control. It does nothing to get growth in other prices under control. The stimulus here is certainly not disinflationary or deflationary. It could potentially be inflationary, and it absolutely does not lower the relevant inflation number that goes into A, what people are spending on all of their goods, and B, what the RBA is going to consider when it is adjusting interest rates. Therefore, when Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese come out and say that they have lowered inflation, or this budget is going to get inflation under control, or it's deflationary or disinflationary, they are simply misleading people. They're pulling the wool over people's eyes. It is misinformation to claim that this budget is deflationary. Because it isn't. And economists do not think that this budget is deflationary. Rather, the overwhelming majority of economists, serious economists, think that this budget is inflationary and will make matters worse, not better. But do let me know your thoughts about this budget in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think about Jim Chalmers and whether he did a good job, a bad job, or whether he is being a little bit disingenuous with some of his rhetoric. I'd be interested to hear what you think.